Wir warten noch einen kleinen Moment, bis der Zoom-Raum sich gefüllt hat. Das kennen Sie ja und wissen, dass das immer ein wenig dauert. Guten Abend schon mal. So, die Zahlen stabilisieren sich. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen zu unserem heutigen Webtalk zum Thema Israels Zivilgesellschaft und der Tag danach. Mein Name ist Frank Weyers und ich leite das Landesbüro der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Mit meinem Team organisieren wir ca. 350 Veranstaltungen im Jahr, online, aber auch in Präsenz. All unsere Veranstaltungen finden Sie natürlich auf der Website der Stiftung freiheit.org oder in unseren Newsletter. Heute sprechen wir über die aktuelle Situation in Israel. Seit über 100 Tagen herrscht Krieg. Nach dem Terrorangriff der Hamas wurden die Proteste der Israelis um die Politik der Regierung, vor allen Dingen um die Justizreform, auf Eis gelegt. Heute diskutieren wir mit Inbal Orpaz, Ido Dembin und Lihi Shmueli über den Wandel, der mit dem Beginn des Krieges eintrat, und darüber, wie sie die Zukunft der Proteste sehen. Ich möchte die Gelegenheit aber auch nutzen, um auf eine weitere Veranstaltung zum Thema Israel hinzuweisen. Am 23. Januar sprechen wir mit Oberst AD Nina Baruch vom Institut für nationale Sicherheitsstudien und Professor Dani Orbach von der Hebräischen Universität darüber, wie israelische Sicherheitspolitik nach dem Ende des Gaza-Krieges aussehen kann. Den Link dazu stelle ich Ihnen gleich in den Chat. Unser Gespräch heute wird auf Englisch sein. Sie haben die Möglichkeit, über Zoom auch eine deutsche Übersetzung zu hören. Dazu nutzen Sie bitte das Weltkugelsymbol in Ihrem Zoom-Fenster. Und des Weiteren haben Sie wie immer die Möglichkeit, über die F&A-Funktion Fragen zu stellen. Aber nun übergebe ich an meinen Kollegen Christoph Klemann. Er leitet das Jerusalemer Büro der Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Christoph, jetzt seid ihr an der Reihe.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for taking part in tonight's discussion. My name is Christoph, and I'm the director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom here in Jerusalem. As the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, we have been working in Israel for more than 40 years now. Almost unbelievable. We had our anniversary event this year, 40 years of work of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and we are extremely proud and honored also to have an extremely vibrant and impactful spectrum of partners in Israel, working on a range of different topics, ranging from liberal political education to entrepreneurship, the promotion of liberal values in all its forms. Also, of course, dialogue programs between Palestinian and Israelis, something that has become very difficult in recent years, and of course, even more difficult since the 7th of October. But I'm extremely also delighted that we have three outstanding guests from our partner spectrums with us tonight, who all stand really for a liberal Israel and who also defend liberal Israel wherever they can. And before I introduce them, I wanted to give just a little context. Frank has just briefly touched upon it already, but I just wanted to introduce the topic very, very briefly so we can start with our discussion tonight. I think that at the outset of a new year, looking back to 2023, one can probably say that the year 2023 was one of the most difficult years for Israel in its history. In the brutal attack of Hamas on October 7th, more Jews were killed than on any other day since the Holocaust. And I think 70 years since the establishment of the state, the very existence of the only Jewish state in the world has been put to test again. And I think that, we all know that since October 7th, Israel is at war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, and is, of course, also directly engaged in military operation in exchange with Hezbollah in the north of Israel. And we hear today also in the news in the last couple of weeks, other proxies of Iran, like the Houthis, pose new threats from the Red Sea, not just for Israel, but also for the entire Western world. And in Israel, we see, I think, a nation, I mean, I've been here only for a couple of months, but we see a nation that is on high alert, but also an entire nation that is in deep pain of what has happened since October 7th or on October 7th, and is of course desperately also waiting for the return of the hostages that were brutally captured by Hamas. Now, for today's topic, of course, we all very much remember that before October 7th, Israel also found itself in a difficult situation, but of course, of a completely different kind. That was when we all remember large-scale protests rocked the country, and these protests were a response to the government's policy to push a wide-ranging judicial overhaul, which not only aimed at kind of changing the existing checks and balances of Israel's democratic system, but I think which also, and many saw that from the protests movement as such, actually aimed to maybe undo the very nature of Israel's democracy. And the sheer magnitude of these protests, I think, was extremely remarkable. You know, weeks after weeks, we saw hundreds of thousands of protesters taking it to the street. And if you put that into perspective to, for instance, Germany, in relation to the population of Germany, that would mean that every week over the course of several months, we would have millions of people coming and taking it to the streets in Berlin and in other cities in Germany. So the magnitude of the protests against this judicial reform were really, really remarkable. But I think also, and one has to realize that this kind of protest also meant there was a fierce struggle between the advocates of the reform and the opponents. And it lay open some of the divisions in Israeli society about the very nature of the state one wants to live in and the role of its institution. And that is what we want to discuss today in our upcoming talk. We want to recall and discuss and understand the meaning of this period of social and political upheaval, what impact those protests had on Israel and also its social cohesion, and how has October 7th changed that, and how has October 7th impacted the protest movement, and what, of course, we can expect after the war to the government's policy as regards to the judicial overhaul, but also to the protest movement as a whole. And these questions we are going to be discussing with our distinguished speakers of tonight. And I welcome Lihi Shmueli, Inbal Orpaz, and Ido Dembin, who are all, as I said at the beginning, members of our FNF partner network here in Israel, and who are really leading figures within the vibrant civil society of Israel. Lihi, she is the Deputy Director of Israel Hofshit, an organization advocating for policy change on issues of state and religion in Israel. She has been working with the organization for more than 4 years, and they have been a dear partner to our foundation, implementing many, many programs together with us. I'd like to welcome Inbal Orpaz. Inbal is a strategic innovation consultant, a journalist, and a founder of the Women in Tech initiative. She was extremely engaged during the protest. She will talk about this a little more later. She also serves as a consultant to the Israeli Innovation Authority and is a former researcher at the renowned Institute for National Security Studies. And finally, Ido Dembin, he is the executive director of Molad, Molad being an independent, non-partisan Israeli think tank that works to renew Israeli society by bringing to the table new ideas in all kind of different aspects of public discourse. Molat has also been an advocate, a strong advocate against the status quo as regards to the question with the Palestinians. And they have been also a dear partner of our foundation, and we are very much looking forward to our work ahead. Let me start with asking Lihi from Israel Hofshit. Not everyone is, of course, familiar here of the audience of the organization. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. I said, you work on the relationship between state and religion. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Israel Hofshit. Also, maybe just briefly touch upon, how did you experience the protest movement, and how did it also affect your work as an organization?
There's a lot of difficult questions at once. Okay, so we'll start with Israel Hofshit. Israel Hofshit, as Christoph said, is the leading organization in the field of religion and state in Israel, which, as many of you probably know, is is very tied together. And so when we're trying to promote religious freedom and pluralism in Israel, this is a very wide field, and it involves a lot of issues that each one of them requires a whole organization. Okay, but for example, we're trying to promote civil marriage in Israel, because right now you can only get married through the religious institutions. We're trying to promote during Shabbat in Israel. We don't have public transportation. We don't have commerce, and we strongly believe it affects the opportunities that people have and the equality and the way that people can, provide for themselves during the weekend. So we're trying to promote that as well. Trying to promote LGBTQI rights, trying to prevent gender segregation and promote gender equality. So we do have a lot on our plate, especially this wonderful year with this wonderful government. This is generally speaking about Israel Hofshit. I think that you said it very well, Christoph, that this year is, I think, maybe one of the most crucial years in our history. I feel like we are writing the history books of the country, and it almost feels like, bless you, it almost feels like we're not sure what would be the next word in this book, right? It's like, would it be Jewish, democratic, liberal, all of the above, none of the above? What would it be? And I think that when it comes to the very core and the very nature of who we are as a nation, as people, I think that this year, and it's not just this year, right? It's looking ahead at 2024. It doesn't gonna look very much different. But I think for us in civil society, especially, it's a crucial time to speak up, to raise our voices, and sort of shift the way this country is going towards. To be honest, when I'll share a story. Okay, we'll start with something very private. About 7 years ago, I came to my parents and I told them that I'm not so sure what am I exactly, but I think I have a girlfriend. Okay, and my mother was like crying all night. It was horrible. It was very sad. But I was trying to tell her, it's not such a big deal. We'll have normal life. And she kept telling me, it's hard enough to be a woman in this country. So to have two of you together and to start a family like that, or to try to start a family like that in a very sort of conservative, religious country in many ways, she was very concerned about how our life would look like. And I was very certain in the way I was trying to reassure her that everything would be fine, right? We're a liberal country, to democracy, everything would be just fine. To be honest, 7 years later, here we are today, I'm not so sure it would be. I don't have the ability to reassure her as I was 7 years ago. And I think part of it and part of our responsibility as civil society organizations is to make sure that I would be able to reassure my mom that yes, it will be fine. It will be fine for us, and it would be great for our kids. And I think in these terms, as weird as it feels to talk about, life before October 7, I think this is just, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to be optimistic, okay, and say that we have to come back better and stronger from that as a society. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. But like, how would you say, like you said, I mean, how much did last year protests impact you on a personal level? I mean, did you feel that, these protests really spoke your mind, and were you scared that, where is Israel heading to? How did that kind of impact you on a personal level?
Personally, we were, myself, my partner, my family, my friends, we were very scared regarding what would be the nature of this country and what would be the values that lead us as a nation. And I've been working in civil society organizations all my life, and that's all I know. But it's all, to be in the liberal camp in Israel, it can sometimes feel like you're always on the opposition, right? And you always try to fight for justice in places like there's always injustices. And I think that for me personally, the feeling that was every Saturday to go out to the streets and have so many people, to getting goosebumps, to have so many people with us after so many years. We've been trying to advocate for these issues, and having people understand how important it is that you can't, if it sounds like a duck, if it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If they say they're going to promote religious, misogynist, racist, you name it, character to this country, they mean it. And once people saw that we're actually going towards this direction, it feels like everyone like shook up and said, okay, so we have to go out to the streets. So for me personally, it was probably the saddest and happiest times to be a citizen in this country. And of course, it impacted our work tremendously, but I assume we'll get to that later.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Inbal, I would like to turn to you. I mean, you, as I said, you are very much coming from the whole, tech ecosystem in Israel. And what was interesting, I think, also that a lot of people from the tech industry also organized themselves, and you were one of the organizers of the so-called tech protests. Where those tech entrepreneurs, that industry that is really leading, economic growth in Israel, were very much engaged in the protests. And I think that was also for really the first time that the tech industry felt that they have to stand up for a liberal Israel, and were so engaged in protests against government policies. How did you experience these kind of social protests, and what made you actively, coming from the field of tech entrepreneurship, what made you kind of join this protest movement?
So actually, if we go back on time exactly 1 year ago, this is when it all started. And for me, it was just, a simple invite to a WhatsApp group telling me, listen, there are some people from the tech ecosystem and use some of them, and they didn't know many of them, and told me, yeah, we're starting to do something. And for me, I admit it, at first I was a bit skeptic because as a former journalist who covered the tech industry in Israel for many years, I always believed, and I still do believe, that it's a very important conjunction between the Israeli society and the Israeli economy, and that the tech industry should be part of it and should promote this country not only as an economical growth engine, but also as a social one. But for many years, when you met people from this industry and the leaders of this industry, they would say that, or they would feel that maybe they live here and their businesses are here, but actually they run their business and their market is outside Israel. Israel, it's like, an island economy, it's a small place, and they didn't really care much about what is going on here. And they were like, okay, we are not involved, we are not getting into politics. There was maybe one small example in 2018. There was a protest of gay parents for their ability service. Thank you, Lihi. And that was actually the first time the tech companies, they supported some kind of a social fight in Israel. Back at the time, Microsoft in Israel, they joined this protest. But in a way, in Israel, that we have the highest fertility rate in the world, and supporting families of all kinds, and helping them to bring children, it's an easy cause. It's people would, they find it usually easily to support this cause. And that was actually the only example that I can mention in history of Israel, or the tech industry in Israel. And actually what happened over the last 12 months, it's really, for me, I think it's historic. It's the first time that people who lead this industry and work in this industry, they realize that they do live here, and even though their market is outside Israel, they should care about what is going on in Israel. Just to get you an understanding, like most of the money raised by Israeli startups come from other places, from the States, from Europe, from other places. So we rely on foreign investors, and this economy needs this money. And they started to realize that if the regime here and the judicial system is going to change, and companies, the investors would be suspicious, and then the entrepreneurs will leave and they would, establish their companies in other places. They realized it's something big, that they should care, and it became huge. So 1 year ago, we had the first protest. I was again skeptical, and it was Tuesday around noon. I arrived not far away from here in the center of Tel Aviv, and there were many of us there just to begin with, and it grew stronger and stronger over time. And people also realized, for example, there is a group within the tech protest that is still active and going to the Knesset, which is our parliament, participating in the committees there. So we also realized there are many things that we can do, of course, to be outside in the streets and, to speak on stages, but also to work through other channels.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much. And how did you perceive that? I mean, we come to that maybe also later, but how has the tech industry, the tech sector reacted after October 7th within the protests? How were they engaged after October 7th, and how has that impacted?
Yeah, so October 7th was Saturday morning, starting on Saturday morning, and usually for us for 40 weeks actually before that said Saturday. Those were the big days in which we went outside to protest every Saturday night. And earlier in the morning, like, we didn't know what would happen and like what should we do. One of the things, there was another big protest group of ex-military people. In Israel, we have mandatory military service, and there was a big issue, for example, with the pilots of the IDF, of the army, who said that they would not volunteer and would come to serve as a reserve service. And in the morning of October 7th, we realized that this event is bigger than anything and worse than anything that we could ever imagine. And just in a few hours, it's not only the tech protest, but all the groups together, we worked closely together. And maybe one of the most important things that we had as a protest movement is the infrastructure of tens or maybe even hundreds of groups, mostly WhatsApp groups. And just within a few hours, we could, mobilize and create things involving tens of thousands of people all around Israel. So just to name a few things that we did, we could raise donations and equipment. There were hundreds of thousands of families, first near the Gaza border, but then also in the northern border near Lebanon, that had to leave their houses, sometimes with nothing, even without shoes, after the houses were burned. So we helped, to get all the equipment, for example, computers or tablets for children to enable them to continue participating in classes, for example. Something very big and important was we had more than 200 hostages taken by Hamas, and in the first days, we didn't know what is happening with them. So we have tech people and we have tech companies involved, and there were groups involved in this. So there were people who just, hours or days or weeks before worked together as a protest group, and then we took all of those abilities and infrastructures and turned them actually into civil society groups. And I think it's an interesting shift, like how the protest movement became a civil society organization in a way. But I think it's not so surprising because, those are people who are thinking about the future of Israel and about making this place a better place. And once we realized that we cannot rely on the government and things moved really slowly, there was no other way. Things just started to happen very quick.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll turn to Ido. Ido, as I said, he is the director of an Israeli think tank called Molad. Can you maybe just also elaborate a little bit on, Molad, what are your goals, what you are working on? And then I wanted to, no, you start with that, and then I'll ask you a more detailed follow-up question.
Okay, I think we can handle that. First of all, thank you. And thanks for the question, because it allows me the freedom to say everything that is in my mind. But I'll try to be brief about it. Molad is an Israeli think tank operating in Jerusalem and all over Israel, obviously, for the better part of the last 11 years, slightly over a decade. The idea behind the founding and the establishment of Molad was and remains recognizing the need in Israeli liberal society and in the Israeli liberal camp, which, as kind of can be understood from both Inbal and Lihi's words, was not exactly a well-established camp up until about a year ago. We wanted to breathe new ideas and new thinking into it, out of the understanding that within Israeli politics and within Israeli public debate and discourse, there really wasn't two sides. For a long time, it seemed as though there was essentially one side, which was the side in power, which not only governed in the sense of keeping control of government and the parliament, but also governed in the way that public discourse is happening in everyday conversations and in everyday discussions on anything at all in Israel. And that includes perceptions of liberalism. It includes perceptions of security, which fumbled on October 7th, but I imagine we'll get there. And of course, perceptions of Zionism. And I dare say that if you're looking for a way to kind of explain why Molad saw the need in its existence, it really shines through two examples. The first being that, and this is something that happened during the protest, I remember distinctively, and I think I told you this, Christoph, the other day, driving to a protest in Jerusalem by the liberal camp against the government, against the judicial overhaul, and waving the Israeli flag from our car, and realizing that everyone on the road beside us is also waving the flag, and realizing that all of those people are protesting the government. They're not on the side of government. And that was a unique shift in a country where it almost seemed like the right wing, the Israeli right wing, being distinguished from other right wings in the world in its populist perceptions, it seemed as though they had either secured or at least declared a monopoly on what Judaism, what Zionism, what Israelism means. And for a long period of time, it was almost a concern amongst anyone who's not on their camp that waving the Israeli flag might be perceived in a bad way. I even had friends who said that they didn't feel okay with waving the flag. And all of a sudden, during the protest, it became an okay thing for Israeli liberals because it reminded them of the country that we want Israel to be, and why we are so proud of what we want it to be, as opposed to what it is and what it perceives itself to be and how the world perceives it. And the other example is fairly similar. When I say I'm a Zionist, and this is nothing new, I think, in many conversations, I often get criticized for it. A lot of people recognize Zionism with what the current government in Israel, which has been the government in changing colors since 2009 at least, what it has done to Zionism. And so when I say I'm a Zionist, people often assume that I am racist, misogynist, chauvinist, and you're not supposed to attest to oneself, but I'd like to think that I'm neither that, this, or that. And I think for a long time, even the term Zionism became fraught with the way that the Israeli conservative or populist camp kind of breathed meaning into it that had very little to do with what it was supposed to mean and everything to do with what they wanted it to mean. And so Molad is here to try and infuse Israeli public discourse with new ideas, or alt new ideas, if you will, in the same way that Herzl's book was called Alt Neuland. And that's what we've been trying to do. We do that through research, through polling, through focus groups, through data, and obviously through quite a bit of writing. I'll stop here, but there's more than enough writing and analysis to go around for later.
Okay. Can you maybe just briefly touch, because maybe not everyone in the audience would know about it, but what was the protests really against, and what was the judicial overhaul? What does the current government try to do with this judicial overhaul, and why did it spark such big protests in Israel?
I think the important thing to realize is that the protests were about slightly different things depending on who you ask. If you ask, I think the majority of Israelis, that the hundreds of thousands protesting in the streets, it wasn't, in most cases, you'd get answers that have to do with the judicial aspects of it, that sought to increase the power of the government at the expense of the already fairly weak Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and obviously at the expense of the Supreme Court, which essentially the overhaul sought to, I don't want to say relinquish its power completely, but definitely remove a lot of its authority and a lot of its power to limit government actions. And had the protest never happened and the overhaul would have gone successfully as any other right-wing initiative in Israel would have done in the last decade or so, Israel would be anywhere between slightly and a lot less democratic, and definitely a lot less liberal today. Just kind of as a taste, currently Israeli Knesset is not, I don't want to say it's powerless, but it is short of power. The Israeli government controls the Knesset out of the parliament. It has a majority in the Knesset, which basically means that parliament is almost helpless and the opposition is almost completely helpless in many cases that have to do with appointing different senior officials, with appointing, not exactly powerless in appointing justices, but the government try to make it so that the opposition would be powerless in that. And essentially the only true branch of government that can stop the government from doing whatever it wants is the Supreme Court. That's not a good situation in and of itself. In other words, we as liberal Israelis should strive to change that as well. But before we even had time to come to grips with it and try to mass some sort of move, the right-wing government saw an opportunity to change that as well and make it so that only them in government have the power to do anything at all. And I dare say, and this is where some people might disagree with me, that their intent was to make it so it will be very hard to ever replace them in power. So that I think is something that needs to be remembered. And for those of you who have been watching Hungary or Poland, it's not dissimilar at all. In fact, the leaders and the thought leaders behind the overhaul explicitly said that they see Hungary and Poland and other slightly less democratic, slightly less liberal states in Eastern Europe as a role model. I will say, though, that while a lot of people objected to the overhaul, there were many signs that other things became part of the protests. Some of the things, for instance, that Lihi spoke about, the issue of religion in Israel, where religion is occupying a hefty place. And just to give you an example, my wife and I got married in France, not in Israel. The reason being that A, so many of our friends can't get married in Israel because they're not recognized as Jewish enough. B, some of them are LGBTQ, and so they can't get married. And C, that even if none of that holds for us, because we're both kind of cisgender, heterosexual Israeli Jews born in Israel, etc., we're not practicing Orthodox religious Jews. And if you're not willing to engage in a ceremony that is directed by Jewish Orthodox tradition, not even Jewish conservative, Jewish reform, just plainly Orthodox, you cannot get married. And so we got married outside of Israel, and then our marriage got recognized by the court, which also goes back to why the government is so terrified of the court. And so I think all of these things, plus public transportation, plus the fact that, as Inbal mentioned, there is this notion of, the tech sector is liberal and it has nothing to do with the rest of the country. That blew up. The idea that the government had that they can do anything they want and the tech sector is just going to kind of accept it for what it is, that blew up, as did many other things. And so I think the overhaul, in retrospect, did us a slight favor by galvanizing a liberal camp that didn't even know it existed beforehand. And it's working on it. It's not quite there yet, but it's working on becoming something new that can retake power.
Okay. Following from that, maybe to Lihi and Inbal, can you maybe also explain, I was telling how big these protests were. I mean, how the magnitude of these protests, how many people went to the street and on a persistent level. I mean, every week you had 100,000, more than 100,000, 200,000 people protesting, not just in Tel Aviv, but also what Ido was just saying, also, I mean, in Jerusalem and other places in Israel. So this was really, from the scale of protests, unprecedented. And maybe you can tell us a little bit of, who was behind these protests? Was this just ad hoc, or were there some leading figures in those protests? Maybe also, how did they operate and what made them in a way so successful? Was this all spontaneous, or was there also some, good organization behind it for such large protests to be able to persist over such a long period of time?
Mm-hmm. I'll start. So there are many groups involved in those protests. Some of them, as I said, for example, the tech protests, but not only, went outside organized for the first time. So there were some groups that they were like the tech protests around, the occupation of people, like for example, people work in the health sector or the mental health. So you had those groups, like your professional guild, but for the protest. And there was a very big group of the women protest named the Building Alternative. That would be the translation now of the name of this group. So that was for the women. And I would also say that, each group had their unique uniform, I would say, like you could recognize the different groups, but by the colors of their t-shirts. So we had like the turquoise, the light blue, and the women, it was red, and the army or former army people, they were called the Brothers in Arms. So they had, the khaki, like the olive green shirt. So it was quite distinguished, but eventually, behind the scenes, we worked all together. There was an infrastructure, for coordinating between the organizations to understand how can we help one another, what are the big things that we are going to do. As I said, like, the one day that every week for 40 weeks was the protest day was Saturday, but very quick we started to organize what we called disruption days, I would call it. Was, midweek, no one is going to work. All the streets in Tel Aviv and in other places are blocked. Huge demonstrations. So it was very big. And, even though there were organizations, and there were also, of course, the local organizations, I can say that, there was one night, the commander of the Tel Aviv police area, it was, no, actually, he decided to leave his position. He said that there were politicians trying to get involved with these decisions. And it was, in the background, there were everything that happened, until this point. And then spontaneously, late night, we went outside protesting here, not far away from Lihi's office in the center of Tel Aviv. And in this night, the Tel Aviv police got really violent. And they had, this water car, spraying really hard on protesters. And I was outside in the highway of Tel Aviv. Like, this is what we did. We blocked the highway, and then they came with this car, and I got hit on my back, and and fell on the ground. And it was very, it was very painful and strong, and it was a very difficult night that night. And then I posted about it in Facebook, and this post got really viral. And then what happened next is I was invited as a speaker to other protests all around the country. So then I had an opportunity to go to places, to villages, to kibbutzim, which are, very small places in the north of Israel, in the south of Israel. And then, I got the opportunity also to see very closely the protest outside Tel Aviv or outside the big city. So it was really all across the country. So yes, it was organized, but it was really authentic. Overall, millions of people went protesting over the last year, and you cannot force it. And I think that, at this point, the protest movement is asking itself, like, what should we do now on October 7th? Like, as I said, like, we stopped everything. There were 1 million people who got, infected or affected by the war. They were either they had to leave their homes, and now they're displaced within Israel. And you had, everyone who lives around the area of Gaza, and you have the people. It's about 300,000 people who were called to the reserve service. So many people, our life didn't go on, normally. And so also the protest movement, paused for a minute and people, had to do other things. And nowadays the protest movement is asking itself, like, what should we do next? Like when you're looking at surveys being conducted in Israel, so we see that the majority of people in Israel, and it doesn't matter, for who you voted or, if you're left wing or right wing, most of the people, they believe that this government should go, that, we had enough of them, and what happened on October 7th is on their responsibility. And now the question is how and when. Like those are maybe the two questions that are still open. And some people say, yes, now it's the time to go back to the streets and protest and, just to make this government fall. And others say no, while, things are happening outside and we have to sit and wait and be quiet. And you see that you cannot force it. Like even if some organizations do want people, to go outside and protest. So yes, every Saturday there are again protests, but they are much smaller. Maybe I think it's maybe 20,000 people a week, but it is growing. Like I think that things are starting to move.
Okay, yeah, that would be. Before I go for the next question, I just wanted to say to the audience, I see that we already have some questions that you have posted in the Fragen und Antworten section. You're happy to do so. I will take some of the questions a bit later, but please, feel free to post questions to the participants, to the guest speakers. You can also do so in German. I'm happy to translate it. So if you don't feel comfortable writing in English, I'm happy to translate those into German. Inbal, you touched about, the social cohesion and in Israel, maybe after October 7th, where the country really came together and the protest came, of course, to a halt. There was a common understanding, I think, in the Israeli society that now, we have a bigger fight to take on, and that is, the fight against terror organization Hamas. Maybe Ido, if you want to touch, also because, of course, I was saying earlier, and you were alluding to it, that the Israeli society somehow is divided into two camps. It's polarized in a way, and that has also been shown in the protest. I mean, that is not I would say, an Israeli phenomenon. If you look all over the Western world, in Western democracies, we see this kind of, split in societies. But how has the October 7th changed that? And do you expect, I mean, Inbal was already alluding to it a little bit, but do you expect that to kind of come to a surface at some point again, after this war consensus is over?
Those are a lot of big questions. I'll try to go kind of by chronological order. I think even before, not only October 7th, but even before all of this past year, Israeli society was already divided. It's enough to remember that we had 5 separate elections over a period of 3.5 years, including 3 elections in a row where no government could be established. And the only moment where such a government was established was during the height of COVID. So the so-called excuse for a new government was the need to fight against COVID instead of trying out for a new election while everyone is supposed to stay at home and avoid contact, wear masks, etc. So even before all of this, Israel was very much divided and very much so in the middle. The elections kept ending up in draws or close to draws and not allowing anyone to form a governing coalition. What had happened when the Minister of Justice in Israel, Yariv Levin, held his now infamous press conference that essentially declaring what the overhaul is going to be like, and the protest immediately began, I think that cemented a line in the sand in the view of the Israeli populist camp. They felt like they had just about enough power to get away with whatever they wanted, whereas the other camp, the losing camp, was still reeling from a terrible election result. And essentially, and this is why I said we kind of owe flowers to the government, is because that helped the liberal camp in Israel, which was so beaten, find a new purpose. And even more so, it allowed people who wouldn't traditionally find themselves aligned with the so-called center left in Israel, the liberal camp, the pro-peace camp, it allowed them kind of a way and even a want to move when they started realizing what their camp was about. They started seeing what the populist camp was doing to Israeli democracy, and they started to feel like this is not my political home anymore. And I think in the aftermath of October 7th, I think October 7th could not have happened if it wasn't for the year that preceded it. That's one thing. So in other words, it's not that Hamas could never have attacked Israel, but the way it did, the timing in which it did it, and the amazing and horrible results that it got, that they could not have achieved it if they had done it to a different Israel. But Israel was already going through change, and the way it's going to emerge from the crisis of October 7th, and make no mistake about it, that crisis is still ongoing. We are 100 and something days into that crisis. We haven't forgotten, we haven't forgiven, and we've definitely not moved on from it. Whichever way Israel comes out of it is going to be a different country. The question really is what different in how, in what way is it going to be? The way I see it, and pardon me for switching slightly to the security diplomatic arena here, up until the conflict, Israelis were under the pretense that everything was all in all okay. It's not that Iran is not a risk, it's not that Hezbollah is not a problem, but it's all contained. We've got Hamas under control, we've got the West Bank under control, and it got to a point where it was really hard to see any leader in the Israeli political scene offering something different. It kind of felt like Netanyahu and Benny Gantz and all of the people who want to be prime minister or at least some sort of minister held the same view, which is we can't resolve the conflict, but we can live with it. And that's what we're going to do. And kind of hope that everything turns out for the better. Trust in the economy, trust in the tech sector, trust in everything else that's happening, and we're going to be okay. And a lot of it was burying our heads in the sand. And now, with everything that's happened, you immediately saw a lot of people kind of giving up hope on the idea that we can just manage the conflict and everything is going to be okay. The question now is what kind of solution people are going to be willing to look out for. The way I personally see it is Israel needs to defeat Hamas. That's a given. And Israel will have to find a way to bring security back to the people in the Israeli north, where close to 100,000 people have been evacuated from their homes because of a threat of war, not even because of an active war. But after it, Israel was going to have to choose. And right now, the choice is very stark. It's between the current government, which is still led by the same people who did the judicial overhaul. It's still Benjamin Netanyahu. It's still the far religious right, which I like to call the fantasy camp because their policy proposals are completely detached from reality, on one hand. Or there's another side who has often been blamed of being naive, but is in fact the only side that presents some sort of pragmatic thinking, which says, we're here, the Palestinians are here, Iran is still looming, and we have a choice whether we want to find some way to draw a path for an optimistic future, or do we want to fully become Sparta? And I'm gonna finish with this. The other day, about a week ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Israel is going to be Sparta when it comes to war, and Athens when it comes to democracy. But there's a reason why Sparta and Athens could not coexist in one country. You can't be both. You can't have a thriving economy that has foreign investors and a liberal city in Tel Aviv or a liberal state in Israel with open society and equality and justice, and at the same time consume all of your efforts, all of your finances, and all of your diplomatic abilities in fighting endless wars in 3 different fronts. Even the mighty IDF, which I'm proud to say I served for 5 years in as an officer, even that army is not all capable, omnipotent. And the Israeli public is going to have to make some sort of choice between an open, liberal country that acknowledges its neighbors and seeks some version of coexistence, I dare not say peace, or it elects to go for a Spartan kind of militant, militaristic, messianic state. And, if it chooses the latter, we're going to have a problem. Much bigger than any problem that we had so far. But I like to think that we're going to eventually choose the former. But that's an age-old debate between me and my father. So we'll have to see who wins that one.
Okay, thank you, Ido. Lihi, I mean, Ido touched upon it already a little bit in his answer just now, but what do you expect from the protests? Will there be renewed protests, after the war is over? I mean, it also depends under what kind of circumstances the war ends and when the war ends. But do you see that, there is going to be this momentum of the protests will be carried on after the war is over? And, does this kind of war, when do you expect this kind of war consensus to break down? Maybe we have already seen it now breaking down with, a lot of the protests, especially from the hostages families and so on. How do you see that dynamic going?
I will connect to what Inbal said earlier about the protests being on Saturday nights. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but the the routine of Saturday night, in the center of Tel Aviv, protesting against the judicial reform has shifted. Okay, we're in the same place, but now we're with the families of the hostages every Saturday night. Many weeks also during other days, but Saturday nights have shifted from protesting against the judicial reform to protesting for the hostages to come back, to bring them home. And so first, I think it's probably the most Israeli thing that could have happened, right? It's like to be so resilient and adjust ourselves so quickly and okay, so this is where we need to focus now, bring them home, finish this war and learn to live together, and then we'll sort of solve the internal issues that we have. But I think that this is not something that you can, it's not once we'll be done with the war, we can start solving our internal issues. I think it's part of it. And I think this is why you can already see that everyone who's protesting on Saturday night, even if they're protesting against this government and asking them to resign, once they finish their protest, they all move, all thousands of them going together to meet the hostages' families and protest with them. Okay, this is the Israeli reality these days, and I think going back to what Ido said, I think this is the exact essence of that. If we're going through all of that to eventually become Sparta, no thank you. No thank you. This is not what we signed up for. To be honest, this is not why my grandmother escaped Europe in the 1940s from the Holocaust war. This is not the country she came to build here. And I think for us, it's something that it sort of makes sense to separate that and to say, first we'll deal with that, and then we'll have the time to solve our other issues. But I think it all comes together. Because if we will finish this war to come back and be the same Israel that we were on October 6th, we did nothing. nothing. And I think if there is one thing that you can take from these horrible times that we're going through, is that we must come back better from that as a society, as a nation. There's no other way. Because if we will go back to be this, crazy, fanatic, extremist government who leads us towards hell. So no, there's no point of fighting this war. There's no reason to keep this country alive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take just two questions randomly now from the audience, and you can decide whoever of you would like to touch upon them. There are some interesting questions there. One is it right to say that Israelis are much more political minded people than what we find elsewhere? I mean, honestly speaking, I don't know. I don't want to answer the question, but I've experienced since the couple of months I've been living here that, you know, politics is everywhere and you have political debates all the time with everyone, which I very much enjoy. But maybe I hear it from you guys. How do you feel about that?
I think it's your call. We are biased. You know, this is what we know. Like you're, you know, the observer from the outside.
I think there's no way you can grow up in Israel and not be political. Even those who say I'm not politically involved are very much involved because they do have opinions and they are advocating for different issues, right? People think that if being political means that I'm part of a certain political party and I'm voting in the elections or whatever. No, being political is deciding how you live your life. Everything in our life is political. The way I choose to manage my life, where I live, what I eat, where I stay, everything is political. And so I think in Israel, there's no way to go around it. Like you must. There's no other way.
And even when you're looking at the decision being made, Ido was talking about the budgets. Like, you know, we have a society, a group here that does not serve in the army. All of us, we have to go to the army for 2 years, for 3 years, and we have a growing population that is not serving in the army. And then it goes to budgets related to education and to other things. So, of course, everything, you know, it's very political. And I think it's also refreshing that now people are really, you know, they're awake. So, you know, in the tech, in a different, like as I said, we have tons of them. So different tech protest groups, like you see everything, you know, even very small, and everything that is very, you know, is marginal or not really important. Now it becomes like, hey, why did they did it? Why this decision has been made? What is this budget? Like now people are even more aware than they used to be before.
Maybe to add on that shortly, I think that if there's something that people understood in the past year is that in these times, sitting on the fence is as worse as collaborating with this government and these extremist ideas. And I think this is a massive change, that even if you're not considering yourself as a political person, like most of my friends, right? I used to be the crazy one for years, right? Going to protesters and advocating for different issues and injustices. But now it would be weird if you would not be going to a protest on a Saturday night, right? And I think it's a major shift in the Israeli society in these terms.
If I can jump in, I'll just say that truer words have never been spoken. It got to a point where not going on a Saturday night instigates immediate FOMO. You feel like you're missing out on the most important thing that you could have been doing at that moment in time. It's not even about the cool thing to do. It's about the most important thing to do. Every day and every protest felt like an elation, you know, where you feel there's a song in Hebrew, and in Hebrew it says, "Pitom kam adam baboker margish ki hu am vematchil lelekhet." Suddenly a person rises in the morning and feels like a people and begins walking. And that's kind of how it felt. It still feels like that.
Okay. Thank you very much. You kind of confirmed a little bit what I have experienced so far here in the last couple of months. There are several questions a little bit looking ahead, but more looking ahead at the political landscape. You know, maybe also we can touch upon, you know, the role maybe of some of the leaders from the protest movements. But we had some questions here also in the chat asking, you know, who could be an acceptable alternative to Netanyahu? You know, which parties or politicians can bring about the change that is needed? But, you know, do you expect like a profound shift in Israeli politics after the war? And if yes, you know, how would that look like? Or do we have more of the same what we have seen in the last 10 years? I mean, what are your perspectives on that? And then maybe also, as I said, touch upon, you know, do you see that some of the leaders from the protest movements might be, you know, the future leaders of certain political parties or even new political parties that would arise in Israel?
I think I can address the very near future. On February 27th, we have the municipal elections in Israel. And you can see that many people that were not previously engaged with the municipal politics or politics at all are now running for office and running for city councils. Like it's not. Right, I knew that. And I think I think that looking at that you can see in many of the municipalities in Israel, you can see that many of the
parties.
Many of the parties that are running for office in these elections are groups of people who met at the protests, realized that they believe and share the same values, and decided to act, actually, right? They decided to, okay, so it would be much ambitious thing to change Israel, right? But if I can influence my municipality, and starting with that, and if in every municipality we'll have these groups of people who would make their municipality a better place, eventually we can influence the entire nation. And the municipalities have a lot of power on the day-to-day lives of Israeli citizens. And so I think, and I will leave you to talk about the national politics regarding to that. But I think that looking at the municipalities, I think that in most of the majority of the municipalities, let's say, I think that you can see parties that didn't exist before the protest. People who weren't involved in parties didn't exist and are now running for office and will not just be a small group running for that. Right, they would be in the core of the elections. They would be a part of the councils later. I think it's a major shift in that.
I think I would add to it, and would also talk from the personal point of view. So I think that for many years, the Israeli politics was perceived as something dirty. I would say it would be like, you know, everyone who is going to politics, you know, they have their own interests, they care about themselves, like their motivation is not always, you know, the right motivation. And, you know, the good people, you know, they would leave the floor for other players to be there. And I think over the last years, not just the last year, but over, you know, the last years, I can tell you that, you know, back in the 2021 protest, before not this round of elections, but the previous one, that was for me the moment to realize that, we've been outside protesting for years, which is important, but your power as a protester is limited eventually. Like, if you want to influence the decision being made, you have to be around the table where the decisions are being made, and you have to be a decision maker yourself. And for me, I didn't plan to run. I'm running now with a party to the city council of Tel Aviv. It's a group which is a combination of 3 parties. One of them is called the New Contract, with this aspiration of new contract between the people and, the city or the country. And it's a group of people that all of us were, we took active part in the different protests. We have someone from the women protest and Brothers in Arms protest and the Academy protest. So we have representatives of the big groups, and we merged with Meretz, which is a left-wing party in Israel, and with the Green Party. So it's a combination of 3 lists or 3 parties. And we are running for the city council. And I didn't think about it, but eventually, this is like, the natural way to go. Like, if you want to influence, then that would be the next step, to influence your municipality or to influence, the whole government. So I think it's still too early to know who are going to be the new players. Unfortunately, I think that, some of the new faces or voices that we hear lately are people who, they lost the most precious thing that they have in their lives. It could be, parents or brothers and sisters, families of, say, hostages or people who got killed in massacre of October 7th. Everyone who got personally involved. So I think those, are people who are not necessarily part, of the leaders of the protest that we had until October 7th, but they are really important, and they paid, and they're still paying the highest price that anyone could pay. So I guess things are going to be different. I hope that things are going, to shift for real, and I hope that I won't be disappointed. But I know that might happen. Ido just described, the 5 or 6 rounds of elections that we had in a row. We don't remember them. It was, it was such.
We just call it Mondays.
Yes. So, I hope I'm not going to disappoint, but I hope that things, and for me, one of the more refreshing or things that make me more optimistic are, that you meet people who used to be on the other side, and now, like, they understand that things have to be different, and that this government, for a year we warned, what might happen. Just a few weeks, 2 weeks maybe before October 7th, I published an article talking about the lessons that we had to learn from the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, about, that you should listen to other opinions, and that you have to, ask yourself all the times, what are the things that you're missing, and that you have to create an environment, where it's okay to be different, to say, to critique the system. And then, the editor 2 weeks later, like, she was like, I read it now, and, everything happened. So for a year we warned, about things that might happen if this government continues to pursue this direction. And then what happened was worse than anything we could ever imagine. So I think many people who didn't think so before, now they realize that, this government is really the worst that we could have, and that it must change.
I don't know, Ido, you want to add anything? The observations.
I mean, beyond saying that I hope that Inbal gets elected, I'd be interested in answering some of the questions in the.
I wanted to ask you, because there's one question I really wanted to ask you, because I know that this is maybe that's I don't know, but yeah, but you can go ahead and pick them out, but I thought that the question, for instance, I mean, that I know that you are very much into the security policy side of things, and you've touched upon it, although this is not maybe the main focus of tonight, but of course it's all interrelated. But there was one question, you know, saying basically in Gaza since 2006, Israel withdrew. What was the effect? Rockets and attacks. While in the West Bank, you know, the IDF is present, there's Israeli settlements, and we have not seen rockets, and we have seen less attacks. So does that conclude to the fact that we need now to be very pessimistic as regards to a two-state solution? Or are there maybe other alternatives that I think you might be advocating for?
I think the most important thing to understand is that almost nothing is exactly as it seems. One of the things that we saw in the immediate aftermath of October 7th is the fight for the narrative that will emerge from the war. And I dare say that the Israeli right wing has been much more effective than the Israeli liberal wing in shaping public discourse on this matter. Oftentimes we saw, and this is not a new argument, but it is a very strong argument, the suggestion that, well, and this is what is basically up in this question, right? Israel left Gaza in 2005. We no longer rule there, then there are no settlements in there. So how can we explain the rise of Hamas? And then how do we seek to promote some version of Palestinian self-governance if this is what happened in Gaza when we gave them self-governance? And I think it's a very good question because it rests on true facts and data, right? It's not just wishful thinking of, oh, you know, I would love there to be peace, and so there will be peace. I'm not willing anything to happen. Instead, I think we should look at it through and pardon my being cold about it. It's very hard for me to be cold about a place where I physically fought in 2009, but I'm going to try to. When Israel left Gaza in 2005, and we can debate why it did so, there are different versions, and there's a podcast by Molad coming out later this year that's going to touch on that. So feel free to follow up with us on that. But when Israel left Gaza, it did so unilaterally. We didn't coordinate it with the PA and Abu Mazen. We didn't coordinate it with Hamas. We decided to up and leave. And that's one first mistake, I dare say. The other thing that we did was Israel raised its settlements with a Z, but then it also took out the IDF with an immediate plan and said, whatever happens inside Gaza happens inside Gaza, and we're going to learn to live with it. In the 18 years since, Israel has done everything in its power to continuously weaken the Palestinian Authority while strengthening Hamas. That was the outspoken policy of the Netanyahu government, which seems absurd right now, but it was the policy. We're going to do that. And the reason for that was Israel trying to make sure that the Palestinians remain divided amongst themselves and no chance for a renegotiated solution ever emerges. And that succeeded, if not in preventing a state, well, there isn't a Palestinian state today, definitely in changing the way people look at it, and more so than anyone else, the Israeli public. And even now you can see oftentimes Netanyahu and Netanyahu's peers say that everything is to be blamed on the Oslo Accords, which happened in 1993, or the disengagement, which happened in 2005. There's a problem with that. A, there's all the errors that were done, but B, the Oslo Accords were always supposed to be temporary events that were supposed to last for 5 years, not 30 years. The reality that they created was never supposed to be on the ground 30 years later. There's also the slight thing of the prime minister who signed them being assassinated. Then there's the disengagement, where the prime minister who did it, and let's be honest about this, thought that he had the solution. And he neglected to remember that he's mortal. And when he got a stroke and fell into a coma, shortly thereafter, didn't even stand up for new elections in the aftermath of the disengagement, there was no contingency plan. And then we got 18 years of Netanyahu's government, where this concept of managing the conflict prevailed, where strengthening Hamas prevailed and weakening the PA prevailed. And we got to the position even before October 7th, where Hamas is a strong, independent entity in Gaza, and we know what Hamas is interested in. We need to listen when people tell us what they are, and Hamas told us what they are. And the PA is perceived in the West Bank as almost the contractor for the state of Israel. Well, at the same time, in Israel, it was perceived as no one we can talk to because Abu Mazen is old, he's weak, he didn't stand for election in 16 years, etc. So we hold a lot of responsibility for what happened. And this isn't to say that Palestinians don't have responsibility. God knows they do. And in the cunning words of Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abba Eban, the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But that doesn't mean Israel has been very good at utilizing its opportunities. We haven't been an amazing partner for peace. Now, having said all of that, moving forward, it's a very potent question. Like, okay, who are you going to make peace with now? It should be stated, Israel cannot make peace with Hamas, nor should it. It also can't make peace with the PA because, again, Abu Mazen is an 88-year-old man with no control, and even less than 5% of the people support him at this point. But there is a distinction to be made between the leadership and the people. And in the same way that we as liberal Israelis ask the world to not view us as Netanyahu just because he's our prime minister, I personally think we can't truly say to all 2 million Palestinians in Gaza and almost 3 million in the West Bank, you are all Hamas. Even if polling, by the way, suggests some support for Hamas, which before the war was declining and after the war rose, as in almost any other country that I know, there's a rally around the flag feature. George W. Bush was not a loved president, but he got to 90% support in post 9/11. I would suggest not to inhale all of that too much. But moving forward, Israel is going to have to realize that a solution is a must because there is no alternative. It's not that you don't have to love them, okay? I don't love Palestinians. I dare say that as a peace activist. I know it's not a lot of left-wing Israelis say like, oh, we're all friends. We're not friends, and it's okay. We don't have to be friends. You don't make peace with your friend. I don't need to make peace with my wife. We made peace with the Egyptians in 1979, 6 years after the most brutal war in Israel's history up until that point. We made peace with Jordan, who were not our friends. Our border with Syria was the calmest border Israel had between 73 and 2020. All of these things come because a peace agreement or some version of policy agreement doesn't have to come from hugs and P2P and love. It needs to come from a cold realization that endless wars mean endless death and not too much hope. H.G. Wells said, if we don't end war, war will end us. I firmly believe that. And I have no desire to see my kid, hoping I have one, go and do the things that I had to do 14 years ago in Gaza as a 23-year-old soldier. And I believe that with the help of the United States, with the help of Western democracies, such as Ukraine, such as Taiwan, but definitely such as the EU, France, Germany, etc., and also with the access of moderate Arab states, such as Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, Israel can and should and must strive towards some version of an agreement. I'm not going to draw the line on the map right now, though I can, if you want. But we have to just start by realizing that that's the only solution. A solution of transferring or sending away 2 million people is not going to happen. And Israel doesn't have the capacity, even if it wanted, to just ignore the Palestinians anymore. And so we might not love it, but no one's really asking us.
Okay, thank you very much, Ido. I think it was a very passionate, but at the same time also a realistic maybe approach to how we can view the future with the Palestinians from Israel's perspective, without saying there's no possibility of a peace deal or any kind of deal in the near future, and just managing the conflict like Israel has done in the last 15 years or so. We are now almost at the end, but I wanted to just pick up 2 or 3 questions from the audience before we finish. Maybe because there were also specific questions to Lihi and to Inbal on their work, a little bit that it's their work related. I just want to not kind of obligate those questions. One was to Lihi, that the decision of the Supreme Court to accept Israelis marrying by civil marriage outside of Israel. So that was that a success of Israel Hofshitz, of their lobbying, or how did that come into being?
We were involved with that. We're involved with anything when it comes to promoting civil marriage in Israel. I do have to say that as much as it's something to maybe celebrate, I don't see that as our greatest achievement, right? I can only see that as a milestone looking ahead towards civil marriage. Because if myself, or as Ido said, if we cannot get married in our country, I don't think it's a good enough solution. If I'm not allowed to get married in my own country and I'm being forced to marry elsewhere if I want to have civil marriage, I don't think it's something that we can accept. And so while I do think that it's important that the Supreme Court sort of draws the line where we do need to move towards that, I don't think it's a win. I think it's just a milestone.
Okay. Inbal, just one last question, maybe to you, from Mr. Kaiser here, who's asking or saying that technological superiority is essential for Israel to survive, especially for the military and intelligence. I can't believe that leaders of tech companies aren't aware of their importance for Israel and are focused only on outside. Why is that? Maybe you can explain also a little bit why, there has been, and there still is, I guess, this focus of the IT sector, the tech sector in Israel to focus mainly on markets abroad.
So I'll try to be very brief with this question. Of course, it's not true to say that the Israeli tech sector is not involved in what is happening here at all. We do have to mention that, Israel as a country has been in a war situation actually for 75 years now. So actually the roots of the Israeli tech sector comes from the defense needs. So you have, many people who serve in the technological military units, and they, again, Israel is the cyber country, right? Like, we have those abilities because we had to develop, means to contradict and to deal with this situation. And of course, for example, we have all the defense industry. One of the most maybe known things that were developed in Israel over the last decades is the Iron Dome, which, it was a huge shift. It's a cutting-edge technology enabling us to live here in Tel Aviv or, in many places all around Israel, and to feel okay, even, when we hear the sirens, and even though we don't have shelters in our buildings, because we know that this technology would probably protect us. Of course, it's not always working, and a very, tragic situation, but, it's a technology that changed the whole way that Israel as a country and Israel is, as people seeing, those war and operations over the year. So of course, like, the security situation and the national security in Israel has, impacted tremendously the tech sector, but still people were not involved in politics. It's something different, to say I'm against those ideas or against, this judicial reform than to say, okay, we developed the Iron Dome, which is, everyone would agree that, Israel needs such a technology. So I think that would be the distinguish between the two things.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that we have to call it a day or a night. Mr. Tibes here in the chat, he says, thank you very much for this interesting discussion, and I hope to see you all soon and also healthy and happy as today. And of course, he wishes for peace in Israel. I think that is a nice concluding remark, and it's great. I mean, we have still a lot of participants and viewers in after 1.5 hours of discussion. I think that is a positive signal, and I would like to thank all of you for your input, for the time you have taken to also explain a little bit the background to a German audience, because sometimes, what you hear in Germany, what you read in Germany is not the same what if you hear it really firsthand from such distinguished speakers as we had tonight. And I would like to thank you so much for taking the time, and I wish us all a nice evening. Thank you so much.